My Patreon members' current terminal subclade is I-FT192972, which dates to approximately 1695 CE according to family tree DNA age estimates. My Patreon member's earliest known patrilineal ancestor was born in 1590 in Hampshire, England. In 1639, he emigrated to the New World, and in 1654, he died in Charleston, Massachusetts. My Patreon members' one subclade match shares the same surname for their earliest known patrilineal ancestor. So the patrilineal divergence for this branch occurred in the United States after my Patreon member's earliest known patrilineal ancestor had already emigrated from England. Hampshire, England is the region on the map that is shaded in red. And Charleston, even though it's a neighborhood in the city of Boston today, back when my Patreon member's earliest known patrilineal ancestor emigrated there, it was actually its own town and was once the capital of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. During the late Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, the vast majority of people positive for haplogroup I1 today would have had patrilineal forefathers living in the regions that are shaded in red, and this applies for my Patreon member as well. Unfortunately, my Patreon member does not have any ancient DNA or notable connections that connect to his patrilineal line in any type of recent history that would aid in solving the patrilineal migrations of his forefathers. The closest ancient DNA samples and notable connections, which I listed in the following image, diverged apart from his patrilineal line with the IZ2541 subclade, which dates to approximately 4,000 years ago. So it's not very helpful because at this time, my Patreon members' forefathers were still living in the general Scandinavian region. But interesting to see that he does share an ancient connection with Ludwig van Beethoven. Due to the lack of this ancient evidence, I'm going to have to rely on modern distributions to try to piece together the narrative for the migrations of his patrilineal forefathers. But I just want to stress that ancient DNA is much more reliable than modern distributions because people can move around a lot over centuries and millennia from when a person might diverge from their patrilineal line and where they are living today. But that being said, this is the only data I have to work with, so I'm going to presume that there were no backwards migrations and that people did not move too far over time. My Patreon member has a pre-Roman Iron Age subclade labeled IS2273 that has a modern tester that lists Lithuania for the earliest known patrilineal country of origin. So I'm going to assume that at this time, my Patreon members' forefathers were still living in the general Scandinavian Baltic Sea region. Additionally, my Patreon member has a current era subclade labeled IBY51642, which dates to approximately 313 CE, and there is a modern tester that claims Sweden for their earliest known patrilineal country of origin. Now, once again, barring any type of backwards migrations, I'm just going to presume that my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers were still in the general Sweden region at this time during the Roman Iron Age. If you've seen previous videos of mine, then you know that I believe that the North Germanic Danes originated in southern Sweden during the Roman Iron Age prior to migrating westward into what is modern-day Denmark. So I believe that my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers would have entered England from Scandinavia with the Danish Vikings. If hypothetically, for some reason, there were other explanations for this modern Swedish and Lithuanian testers, and there were possible backwards migrations over the centuries, then it is theoretically possible that my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers entered England prior than the Viking Age. It's good to keep an open mind when dealing with only modern distributions, as opposed to ancient DNA evidence, which is more concrete. My Patreon members' oldest subclade that only has modern testers that claim England for the earliest known patrilineal country of origin is the I-FT192972 branch, which dates to approximately 758 CE. Now, what's really interesting about this branch is that the testers list the village of Sutton Courtenay in Oxfordshire in the 1600s for their earliest known patrilineal ancestors. Now, this village is only 44 miles away from my Patreon members' earliest known patrilineal ancestor in Goodworth, Clatford, Hampshire, approximately around the same time period as well. Now, this is important because if we presume that these two patrilineal locations are a coincidence as opposed to indicative of them sharing a common patrilineal ancestor in that region during the 8th century, it's going to imply different patrilineal narratives over time. Additionally, if we presume that age estimates are flexible and can really take place plus or minus a century or two, then that's going to imply different patrilineal narratives as well, as opposed to if we take it as a hard, concrete, accurate date from when they shared a common patrilineal ancestor. So in the rest of the video, I'm going to give different possible narratives based on these different assumptions. I also want to add that my Patreon member has a surname that is Norman in origin. So based on the different assumptions that I'm going to cover in the rest of the video is going to determine whether this Norman influence is cultural with his surname or genetic. If we presume that their earliest known patrilineal locations in that region is not a coincidence and that they shared a patrilineal ancestor in that region, but we assume that age estimates are flexible, then one possible theory for how this Danish Viking patrilineal line entered that region would be with the Great Heathen Army, who fought battles very close to their earliest known patrilineal origins, such as in the village of Basing. If this assumption is correct, then it would imply that the adoption of a Norman surname later on would be the result of a cultural influence as opposed to a genetic influence, since it would imply that their patrilineal forefathers did not leave that region of southern England since the Viking Age. Now, if we assume that that age estimate for that subclade is correct and predates the Viking Age, then we would have to assume that the patrilineal divergence in that region would have to be associated with either the Saxons or the Jutes. It would also imply that those earlier subclade modern testers claiming Sweden and possibly Lithuania could have other explanations than the ones that I gave. And lastly, it would imply that the adoption of a Norman surname was also due to cultural influence as opposed to genetic influence. Now, if we presume that those earliest known patrilineal locations are simply a coincidence and that the patrilineal divergence could have occurred somewhere else, in England or maybe even in Denmark, then there are other possible narratives that can explain my Patreon members' patrilineal forefather migrations. Some of those narratives could include a genetic influence for his Norman surname, with ancestors possibly living in Normandy, France at some time, with maybe even a stop in England first, and then a migration from England to Normandy with the Anglo-Danes, and then maybe another migration back to England from Normandy after the conquest in 1066. There's a whole plethora of possibilities at this point. Denmark and Normandy, France are so underrepresented amongst testers that a current lack of evidence does not necessarily correlate to the evidence not existing at all at some point. Unfortunately, my Patreon members' next two subclades only have modern testers that list the USA for their earliest known patrilineal countries of origin. So unfortunately, there's no additional insight in terms of origins regarding these two subclades. That being said, though, they both have English surnames, and the one subclade that dates to approximately 1220 CE, when people would have started adopting surnames, also has a Norman origin surname, similar to my Patreon member, which is interesting. Okay, what additional information can we learn from his STR matches? Well, his one subclade match from the USA that dates to approximately 1695 CE has a genetic distance of 2 to him at Y111. And he has another STR match genetic distance of 2 at Y111 with the same surname. So potentially, if this person were to upgrade to Big Y700, perhaps they might form a new subclade more recently in time than 1695 CE, since my Patreon member does have currently 6 private variants. Additionally, my Patreon member has some Y67 STR matches that list the same earliest known patrilineal location of Sutton, Courtenay, Oxfordshire as the other subclade matches at the I-FT96500 subclade, but they have a different surname. So be interested to get these people upgraded to Big Y700 as well, so we could get more information regarding that subclade to possibly find out one day which surname is the authentic one and which one might be a non-paternal event. And lastly, he has other Y67 STR matches with completely different surnames that I can't fit on the haplotree currently. So hopefully by upgrading them to Big Y700, we can see exactly how they fit in regards to his patrilineal line. Thanks for watching.